You've arrived at CozySideAudio, where dreams begin with a story. Whether you're studying, journaling, or just chilling, this one's for you. If you vibe with this kind of content, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe for more.
CozySideAudio presents Backdraft Gorge, Escape from an Inferno. Chapter 1. The forest greeted them with silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that makes you stop and tilt your head at the wind threading through pine branches. This silence pressed against their backs, wrapped itself around their ankles like a warning. Caleb didn't say anything, but he noticed it the second they stepped out of the truck and onto the dirt shoulder. He ran a hand along his jaw and then scratched beneath his ball cap, scanning the canopy. "Too dry," he murmured. Benny didn't hear. Or if he did, he chose to ignore it. Benny had that grin again, the one that said this is going to be one of those hikes we talk about for years. He was already adjusting the straps of his pack, tightening them across his chest with practiced tugs, bouncing a little on the balls of his feet. Excited, unbothered. Caleb envied that about him sometimes, the ability to shove aside everything but the trail ahead. They weren't parked at any kind of official trailhead. No welcome sign, no "You are here" kiosk, riddled with faded topography and graffiti. Just a bend off the shoulder of an old Forest Service road and a narrow game trail worming its way into the brush. This was the kind of hike you had to want to find, the kind you had to dig up on old blogs or from locals who spoke in half-warnings and distant landmarks. Perfect. It was Benny's pick. He always found the weird spots, the overlooked ridge lines and unmaintained switchbacks that never showed up on apps. According to him, this area was once a proposed national monument until a fire swept through years ago and rerouted funding elsewhere. The scars were mostly gone now, he claimed. Grown over, forgotten, a hidden pocket of unspoiled wilderness. "Bet you $10 we're the only ones out here for miles," Benny said, his voice bright against the pine shadow. Caleb didn't answer. He knew it was probably true. The heat was building already, not even mid-morning. It didn't press like summer heat. It clung, thin and brittle, like the world was coated in dry grass. They set off without fanfare. No selfies, no countdown. Just the quiet crunch of boots over pine needles and dust as they followed the narrow path uphill. The slope rolled into them gradually, winding higher through a forest that had once seen better decades. Stunted ponderosas leaned out from granite, bark darkened with sap, limbs brittle, green clung stubbornly to their crowns, but Caleb saw the signs, drought-stressed, some hollowed out by beetles. Others leaning in awkward positions as if bowing to a pressure no one could see. For the first hour, they didn't say much. Benny led, humming once in a while, tapping a rhythm against his thigh with a stick he'd found. Caleb lagged by a few paces, adjusting his shoulders against the weight of his pack, eyes always flicking along the tree line. Listening. It wasn't that he expected trouble. He wasn't paranoid, just tuned in. Hiking like this, off-trail and hours from help, wasn't like strolling through a national park. You had to pay attention. You had to read the landscape like it might change its mind about letting you through. The trail, or what passed for one, tightened as they climbed and the trees thinned. Huge slabs of granite began to appear between clusters of wind-twisted pines. The forest floor was no longer dark and loamy, but dry, almost skeletal. Scrub oak clung to life between the rocks, their brittle leaves ticking like paper in the breeze. Caleb paused at a rise. Behind him, the view had opened without warning. Through a gap in the trees, the valley floor stretched far below, a patchwork of dull green and pale brown. No shimmer of lakes, no paved roads, just empty, sun-scoured distance, the kind of view that made you feel like you were falling up. Benny joined him a moment later, puffing slightly, grinning. "See? Told you this place would be sick." Caleb nodded but didn't answer. Benny crouched to dig a protein bar from his side pocket, and Caleb let his eyes linger across the ridges ahead. Distant shapes folded into each other. More trees, more rock, more shadow. Then beyond them, far off where the air turned to haze, the faintest line of smoke. He blinked. It was gone. Maybe just dust, or morning vapor burned off by the sun. Still, the silence held. They pressed on. By midday, the trail vanished completely, leaving them on a granite spine dusted with dirt and shards of sun-bleached bark. Benny checked his offline map. "Should be a slot canyon up ahead," he said, pointing toward a cluster of broken rock. They scrambled down a slope slick with scree, navigating by instinct and topography. The temperature climbed with them, and every breath tasted like the inside of an attic. Caleb's shirt clung to his back, soaked through. Every now and then, a pine branch snapped loudly somewhere in the forest, making both of them turn. Birds were scarce. Even the insects were quiet. By late afternoon, they reached the canyon, a narrow, crooked gash between two tilted slabs of granite. The air there was dead still, heavy. The sun dropped behind the rim, and the light took on a strange color, less gold, more copper. Caleb dropped his pack and rolled his shoulders. "We set camp here." Benny squinted at the sky. "Yeah, still got time before it gets dark, but this'll do. Kinda eerie, though, huh?" Caleb gave a non-committal grunt and moved to gather wood. Not that it was hard. There was dead fall everywhere. Twigs snapped like old bones. The ground was so dry it crackled underfoot. They didn't light a fire. Even Benny knew better, not in a forest like this. Dinner was cold, jerky and trail mix. They sat side by side on a flat boulder, watching the color drain from the canyon walls. Darkness came fast. Too fast. Caleb tilted his head. Something in the air had shifted. Then he caught it again. Far off, nearly lost in the wind, the faintest scent of smoke. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He just sat there, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the tree line, trying to convince himself that what he'd smelled wasn't real. Because if it was, if that acrid thread weaving through the darkening air meant what he thought it did, then this wasn't just going to be one of those hikes they'd talk about for years. It was going to be the one they never forgot. Chapter 2. The forest didn't wake up the next morning. It lay still, a great slumbering beast under the weight of too many dry days and too little wind. Caleb opened his eyes to the hush and immediately knew something was off. No bird song, no rustling branches, just the dull hush of early light pressing through the thin nylon of the tent. He pushed out of his sleeping bag, shoulders aching from the hard ground. Benny was already stirring, muttering to himself as he pulled on a dry shirt and zipped open the tent flap. "Morning," Benny said, voice croaky with sleep. "Looks like it's gonna be another hot one." Caleb stepped outside. The air hit him like an open oven, dry and thick with the scent of dust and sun-baked pine. Already the sun was high, though it couldn't have been later than 8. He tipped his head back, scanned the treetops. The sky above was washed out, colorless, not cloudy, not clear, just muted, as if something had smudged the blue away. They didn't say much as they packed up. Both were seasoned enough to know when a mood had changed. Caleb couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder, scanning the forest line like something would suddenly emerge from it. The trail they followed, if it could even still be called that, snaked upward into a thicker canopy. A mix of pines and dry firs towered above, some of them half dead, their trunks ringed with bark scars and curling sap. The ground here was coated in brittle pine needles and old cones that cracked underfoot. "Remind me to write a thank you card to climate change," Benny muttered. "This place is one match away from going up like a Christmas tree." "Don't joke about that." Benny shot him a look. "I'm not. Just saying, it's spooky how dry it is." Caleb didn't respond. His fingers brushed the low branches as they walked, and even the green needles crumbled at the touch. Everything felt hollow, abandoned. Even the heat had a strange character to it. Not the radiant heat of high summer, but something thinner, more insidious, like it crept beneath your skin. They moved steadily uphill, navigating more by instinct than by GPS. The canyon behind them vanished quickly as the terrain changed. Ahead, they encountered a slope choked with boulders and loose rock. The ground shimmered in waves of heat, and every step sent plumes of dust into the still air. By noon, they stopped in the shade of a sandstone outcrop. Neither spoke much as they ate. Benny stared into the middle distance, chewing slowly, sweat dripping off his chin. Caleb kept adjusting his bandana to keep the sun off his neck, but it made little difference. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. Benny looked up. "Yeah, I smelled smoke last night. Thought maybe it was just my imagination, but now I'm not so sure." Benny didn't laugh. That was a sign in itself. "You see anything?" he asked. "No, but look at the air." They both did. It wavered slightly in the distance, not just from heat distortion. Something was layered in it now. Something faint and brownish-gray, like ash that had been smeared across the sky. Benny stood and walked a few steps up a rise, shielding his eyes. "If there's a fire, it's not close. Not yet. We're probably just seeing remnants from something down south." "Or upwind," Caleb said. They stared in silence for a long time. Finally, Benny shouldered his pack again. "We keep moving. Higher ground, better views. If there's anything to see, we'll spot it." They resumed the climb. The terrain grew jagged and unfamiliar. No paths, no cairns. Just open wilderness, swallowing them step by step. At one point, they startled a lone deer, its ribcage visibly outlined beneath thin skin. It bolted without hesitation, vanishing into the rocks with terrifying speed. The sun felt heavier now. Not just hot, aggressive, the kind of heat that sapped your will to think clearly. Caleb had hiked deserts and badlands before, but this was different. Here, the heat had no outlet. It was trapped by the trees, pressed downward by the silence. That silence deepened. By mid-afternoon, the first real sign came. A single pine tree, young, maybe 10 feet tall, stood brittle and blackened along its lower trunk. Not from lightning, not from a full burn. Just singed, like heat had licked at it without permission to consume. They paused. "Okay," Benny said. "Now I'm starting to feel it." Caleb moved closer to the tree, touched the bark. The black came away on his fingertips. They looked at each other. Neither smiled. The sun angled lower, but the temperature barely dropped. Even the shade offered no comfort. That smudge in the sky had deepened. It wasn't just haze. It had weight now. Color, like smoke crawling on its belly across the upper atmosphere. "We need a ridge," Caleb said. "We need to see where this is coming from." They climbed again, following the line of broken cliffs that led upward. As they ascended, the trees grew thinner, revealing harsh slabs of granite and a kind of half-burnt beauty. This wasn't a forest built for people. It was a place meant to endure, to outlast. And right now, it was barely holding on. By evening, they crested a rise. The view unfolded like a silent warning. To the north, a plume, not faint, not smudged, real. A column of smoke rising behind a distant ridgeline, curling high into the colorless sky. Orange at its base, gray in the middle, black at the top. Benny exhaled slowly. Jesus. Caleb didn't speak. The fire wasn't here, but it was coming. Neither of them moved. The wind hadn't shifted. The heat hadn't changed. But the world had. Down below, far past where they'd camped the night before, the forest began to ripple with movement. Not wind, not animals. The air pulsed, like a breath being drawn in. And then the smell. No longer faint. No longer a guess. Smoke, thick and bitter, swept up the canyon behind them. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the forest lit its first match. Chapter 3. Morning came without fanfare. A pale baked light skimmed across the canyon rim, washing the granite in a tired sort of glow. There was no dew, no bird song, no wind whispering between the trees. Caleb's eyes opened to a silence so dense it made his pulse feel louder in his neck. He sat up slowly in his sleeping bag, spine stiff from the uneven rock, and scanned the trees beyond their little makeshift camp. Nothing moved, not even a flick of shadow. Benny was still curled in his bag, mouth slightly open, one hand tucked under his cheek like a kid. Caleb rubbed his face. The air tasted metallic. He stood, stretching, back popping, and walked a few paces toward the canyon's edge. From this side, the forest sloped downward into a mess of granite and brush, and then back up toward a jagged ridge they'd planned to cross today. A long, slow loop that would curve them back toward the truck by sunset tomorrow. At least, that was the plan. Something tugged at him, quiet but insistent. He looked closer. The horizon shimmered. Not the heat mirage kind. This shimmer had depth to it, a subtle movement, a rolling distortion just above the ridgeline like the sky had gone fluid. He squinted, rubbed his eyes. The taste in his mouth sharpened. Dry, bitter, acrid. Smoke. It wasn't thick. Not yet, but it was there. Creeping along the treetops miles away, stretching wide. He turned fast. Benny. Benny mumbled, stirring. Caleb kicked at his boot. Get up. Something's wrong. Still half asleep, Benny sat up, squinting in the morning glare. What? There's smoke, over the ridge. That woke him fully. Benny was on his feet in seconds, moving beside Caleb, shielding his eyes. Where? Caleb pointed. Benny didn't answer right away. His mouth pressed into a line. Could be a prescribed burn, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Out here, Caleb said, with the heat wave we've had. Benny didn't reply. They stood together for a long moment, watching that shimmer roll and pulse like a slow breath. Caleb could feel it in his ribs now, that wrongness, that shift in the air like a vacuum waiting to be filled. They broke camp fast. No breakfast, just water and movement. Packs repacked, straps cinched tight. They decided to climb the eastern slope instead of following their planned loop, hoping for a higher vantage. Benny pulled out his offline GPS map again, comparing ridgelines and slopes. The map wasn't much help. The terrain ahead was jagged and irregular, littered with deep cuts and sharp drops that didn't match what they were seeing on the ground. The brush thickened quickly as they climbed. Manzanita clawed at their legs. Juniper limbs scratched at bare arms. Each step kicked up dry dust that clung to their throats. The sun crept higher, burning down like a magnifying glass. By late morning, they reached a plateau ringed with dead trees. Caleb scanned the horizon again. The smoke was closer now. No longer distant wisps, but a bank of haze smearing the sky in dull bronze. It rolled low across the treetops like fog, but the light within it flickered unnaturally. Benny swore under his breath. Still think it's a prescribed burn? Caleb asked. No, Benny said. Neither of them needed to say it. The fire wasn't ahead of them anymore. It was moving, fast. They turned downslope, angling northeast. The plan now was to loop back early, push hard for the truck. They were miles out, but if they moved steady, they could make it by nightfall. Maybe. But the forest didn't want to let them go. The trail they'd followed yesterday had vanished behind them. Every slope looked familiar. Every rock formation mirrored something they'd passed an hour ago. It was like walking through a hall of reflections. The forest was trying to turn them around. At one point, they stumbled across an old logging road, a faint scar through the brush, half overgrown. Caleb recognized it from their inbound hike. They turned onto it, relief blooming in his chest. Then they saw the first blackened trees. Not just charred, split down the middle, hollowed out, ash and bark curling inward like scorched paper. The ground beneath them was warm, not smoking, not burning, just wrong. They ran for a while, packs bouncing, water sloshing, breaths ragged. Caleb felt his legs start to go rubbery but didn't stop. Not until Benny did, crashing to his knees beside a fallen log. "Wait," he panted. "Listen." At first, there was nothing. Then a sound like wind, but deeper. A rushing, a distant roar. Not thunder, not a plane. Fire. Caleb turned, staring back the way they'd come. A wall of smoke was rising between the trees, thicker now, darker, bleeding through the pines like ink in water, and then through the haze, a flicker of orange. "Go," Benny gasped, staggering upright. They ran again, veering off the road, cutting down slope blindly. The wind shifted, just slightly, just enough to bring the heat with it. The back of Caleb's neck burned. The air felt heavier. The trees around them blurred into streaks of green and brown. They moved like animals now, dodging trunks, leaping rocks, trampling underbrush. No path, no direction. The fire chased them like it had teeth. And somewhere behind them, deep in the forest's throat, a new sound began to rise. A cracking, snapping howl of branches giving way. Caleb didn't look back. He didn't need to. The fire had found them. Chapter 4. They didn't sleep much. Caleb had tried. He'd laid down on his side, wrapped in the thinnest excuse for a sleeping bag, and stared at the canyon wall until his eyes blurred. But his body wouldn't shut off. Every crack in the dark set his pulse spiking. Every shift of the wind felt like a warning, and always, just faint enough to doubt, was that scent. Smoke. He sat up before dawn. Benny stirred, grunted, rolled over. The granite beneath him was still warm from the day before, but the air had a bite to it now. Cold and dry and sharp with something acrid. Caleb stood slowly, stretching the kink from his back. He moved toward the canyon mouth without a word, his boots grinding softly against the dirt. The sky was just beginning to pale, a dull, lifeless gray. No color, no bird song. Just stillness. Then he saw it. Just a ribbon low across the horizon, a smear of charcoal drifting sideways through the trees. It wasn't towering or dramatic, not yet, but it was moving, a long, lazy coil pulled by the wind. "Benny," Caleb said, not loud, not panicked, just firm, sharp enough to cut through whatever dream Benny had sunk into. Behind him, Benny sat up fast. "What?" Caleb didn't answer. He just pointed. Benny scrambled to his feet, mouth already open, eyes narrowing at the thin streak of darkness above the distant tree line. "Oh," he said. A pause. Then, "Shit." Neither of them moved for a moment. Benny pulled out his phone, checked the offline maps, checked the GPS. "It's still far," he said. "We've got time. We're not in the middle of it." But Caleb didn't answer, because it wasn't just about where the fire was now. It was about what kind of forest they were standing in, how dry the air was, how crisp the pine needles felt underfoot. Fires didn't creep in these conditions. They sprinted. Still, panic wasn't useful. Caleb inhaled slowly. Pack up. Fast. No breakfast. They broke down camp in silence. Benny worked quickly, too quickly, fumbling with the strap that wouldn't unbuckle. Caleb double-checked his pack, eyes flicking constantly to that gray smear on the horizon. When they moved out, it was with urgency. Not chaos. Not yet. Just a sharpness to every step, a tension in their shoulders. They descended deeper into the forest, taking a new route, one that curved them away from the visible smoke. But they were guessing. There were no signs out here. No warnings or fire towers or service roads, just raw land and brittle silence. And then the wind shifted. It came all at once, sharp and hot, barreling through the trees from behind them. The scent of burning needles hit, and it hit hard. Caleb froze, turned. Smoke. Not a ribbon anymore. Not gentle. A war. Move, he snapped. They broke into a run, packs bouncing, boots slipping on loose dirt, branches clawing at their arms as they barreled through undergrowth. The trail was gone. Didn't matter now. Direction was everything. Get down, get away, find something open. The forest blurred around them. Shadows and sun and smoke and panic. Benny stumbled once, caught himself. Caleb pulled him forward. They dropped low to duck under a fallen log, pushed through a choke of dry brush that cracked like firecrackers beneath their boots. The roar began like a whisper, a rushing sound, just at the edge of hearing. But it grew, fast, like wind with weight, like something hungry. They hit a slope and skidded down it, barely staying upright. Dust rose around them, but so did the heat. Real heat now. Not just sun, radiant, pressing, the way an oven feels when you open the door too fast. Caleb's lungs burned. He turned in time to see a flicker of orange leap from tree to tree, far behind, but unmistakable. "Faster!" Benny cursed, stumbled again, caught a branch for balance. "We need water. We need—" "There's a creek marked north on the map," Caleb shouted. "Maybe half a mile." They pivoted, veering northeast, trusting instinct and elevation. The smoke chased them, curling between trunks, turning sunlight into dirty gold. Then the trees parted. Not much, just a dry clearing with boulders and low shrubs, but it gave them a second to breathe, to reorient. Benny dropped to a knee, coughing. "We can't outrun it forever." Caleb scanned the tree line. "We don't need forever. We need a break, water, somewhere it can't follow. Like a rock field, or a burn scar, or canyon walls." Benny looked up. His face was streaked with sweat and soot already. "You think we can make it to the next canyon?" "We have to." They pushed forward. The day blurred into a smear of motion and heat and smoke. The fire didn't stay behind. It wasn't a single wall, it was fingers, stretching, reaching, testing new paths. Sometimes they'd stop and hear nothing but wind. Other times they'd hear that roar again, closer, louder, like the breath of some vast creature exhaling through the trees. They reached the creek by late afternoon. It was barely more than a trickle, choked with dead leaves and algae, but it was water. They fell beside it, splashing it over their faces, gulping it down without care for what might live in it. Caleb soaked his shirt and wrapped it around his neck. Benny did the same. They didn't speak much. No point. Every time they paused, the fire reminded them it wasn't far, that it was faster, hungrier. They moved again, upstream toward the rocks, toward anything that might slow the blaze. Evening found them on a granite ledge, chest deep in exhaustion, smoke staining the sky bloody orange behind them. And still, it came, not in flames, not yet, but in heat, in ash drifting like snow, in the way every tree groaned under the weight of it. They didn't talk about stopping. There was nowhere to stop. Only forward, only away. Only the hope that somehow, in all this unmarked wilderness, there was a place the fire couldn't reach. And they had to find it, before it found them. Chapter 5. Smoke moved like water. It didn't billow, not at first. It pooled, sank, drifted low along the seams of the canyon, trickling past boulders and around ridgelines, almost slow enough to ignore. But the second Caleb saw it snaking between the trees, hugging the contours of the granite the way mist might on a cold morning, he knew something was wrong. "That's not drift smoke," he said under his breath. Benny turned to look where he was pointing. "What?" Caleb shaded his eyes with one hand. "That's moving like fog. That means it's close." It took a full 10 seconds before Benny responded. Then his face fell. Shit. They both stood still for a long time, watching the tendrils of smoke slide through the trees like the forest had sprung a leak. It didn't smell thick yet, more like singed grass and heat. But it was there. It was coming. They'd broken camp quickly. Neither said it, but both of them knew now. Something was burning nearby. Something big. They moved fast, back up the rocky slope, retracing the way they'd come the day before. But already the world looked different. Angles had changed, shadows warped, the light had turned a strange pale yellow, like a sun filtered through dust. And the air had lost its edge, no longer crisp but heavy, almost damp, as if the whole forest was sweating. By noon they crested a rise and saw it. Flames. Small at first, just flashes behind the trees on the opposite ridge. But then the wind shifted, and suddenly it was alive. The fire wasn't a line, it was a front, a living thing, ripping through underbrush and leaping tree to tree like it had been waiting for a reason. A wall of it, chewing its way sideways across the slope, fast and loud and impossibly high. They froze. The sound was unreal, like a freight train and a storm and a scream all folded together. The trees didn't crack, they exploded, embers lifted in waves. Caleb grabbed Benny by the arm. "We're not going back that way." They didn't have to say it. Behind them was canyon. Ahead of them was fire. That left only one direction, off trail, east, into unfamiliar ground. They turned and ran. Not a sprint, not yet, but a pace that burned lungs and frayed nerves. They ducked under limbs and scrambled over rock. Pines clawed at their arms. Dust rose with every step, coating their teeth, and always behind them, smoke. It chased them like a tide, faster now, thicker. The further they pushed, the harder it got to tell where the sun was. Shadows came from nowhere. Tree trunks loomed, then vanished. The fire was changing the light itself. They passed no people, no signs of trail, just the raw, clawed skeleton of forest that had grown untouched for decades. "I think this is an old burn scar," Benny said once, panting. "It grew back wrong." They didn't stop to examine it. Late afternoon brought wind. Hot wind. Unnatural wind. It curled through the trees like a breath, always from behind, always pushing forward. At one point, they stopped on a ridge to scan their surroundings, and when Caleb turned, he saw it. A distant tree, half a mile off, igniting like matchstick. He watched the crown burst into orange, branches curling inward as flames wrapped them like fingers. Then another tree. Then another. "Keep moving," he snapped. Benny stumbled, catching himself against a rock. His face was streaked with sweat and soot. His shirt stuck to his back in dark patches. He said nothing, just nodded. They descended into a shallow ravine, thick with ferns and rotten logs. The heat followed. The smoke was thick enough now to taste. Bitter. Dry. Caleb tied his shirt around his mouth. Benny did the same. And still, the fire came. That night, they didn't make camp. They didn't dare. They walked until the ground itself turned to shadow, until even the stars disappeared behind the smoke. When they finally collapsed, it was in a dry wash lined with granite. No trees, just rock. Safe enough for a few hours. Maybe. Caleb set a timer. 2 hours. No more. They lay side by side, packs as pillows, too tired to speak. In the distance, the forest crackled. Neither of them slept. Chapter 6. They didn't sleep. Even after the fire passed them by, even after the roar dulled into a distant whisper and the sky above bled from orange to bruised black. They just lay there, backs against the cool rock wall, hearts thudding like fists behind their ribs. Caleb kept one hand near his pack the entire time, and Benny sat cross-legged, fingers locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When the wind shifted again, it brought with it a faint rain of ash. Fine grey particles that floated down like dead snow and stuck to their clothes, their faces, the sweat-slick backs of their hands. At some point, the silence returned. Not the absence of sound, but the eerie kind, the kind that feels borrowed, as if the world is waiting to see what happens next. Birds hadn't returned. No insects hummed. The woods around them were still. Caleb finally exhaled. It missed us. Benny didn't speak. He just nodded, swallowing hard. A few minutes passed before either of them moved. When Caleb finally stood, his legs wobbled beneath him, knees locking with the effort. Benny rose slower, dragging a hand down his face, smearing ash across his cheek without realizing. They both looked up. Above them, the slope they'd descended hours earlier was a twisted silhouette of blackened trunks and skeletal limbs. It didn't look like the same forest. The green had vanished. The ground had changed color. The path they'd followed was lost under a smear of soot and fallen debris. Caleb tried to say something. He opened his mouth, closed it again. There was no point. He knew it the same way Benny knew it. They weren't going back that way. They moved slowly, cautiously, like they were walking through a cathedral made of char. The fire had rolled through like a living thing, charring everything in its wake. Trees still stood, but they were hollowed and smoldering. Some glowed faintly near the base, pulsing like coals in a forgotten fire pit. Ash coated everything. The trail, their boots, the air. Jesus, Benny muttered under his breath. He wiped his face again. The motion was becoming a nervous tic. Caleb didn't answer. He kept scanning the trees, watching for flare-ups or falling limbs. His mind felt slow, like it was wading through molasses. They hadn't eaten. They hadn't really drank anything. Adrenaline had kept them upright through the night, but it was ebbing now, replaced by something colder. Survival. They crossed through the edge of the burn, skirting areas still coughing out little puffs of smoke. Occasionally, a branch would snap nearby, sending them both diving low, hearts racing again. But it wasn't the fire anymore, just wind and heat playing tricks. The landscape kept changing. What was forest an hour ago became rock and scrub. The trees thinned, replaced by dry gullies and pockets of brittle chaparral. The sun was higher now, cruel and unshaded. It baked the ash into their skin, turned sweat into salt. Caleb pointed ahead, toward a break in the rock. "We follow that," he said. Benny nodded. They kept moving. By mid-morning, their clothes were soaked with sweat and their mouths tasted like charcoal. They stopped once to drink, rationing carefully. Caleb peeled back a power bar and forced it down, chewing each bite until it dissolved. Benny couldn't eat. He just held the bar in his hand until it crumbled. They didn't talk about the fire. They didn't talk about being lost. They just moved. The terrain narrowed. They found themselves following the bed of a dry stream, descending between canyon walls that rose higher with each mile. The heat became more oppressive there, trapped between the rock faces. Echoes bounced back at them, distorting every footfall, every breath. At one point, Benny stopped, just froze. Caleb turned back, confused, then saw what he was looking at. A deer, or what had once been one. Blackened, twisted, legs curled beneath it like it had simply collapsed mid-run. Its skull was partially exposed. The air around it reeked of cooked fur and something worse. Benny gagged and turned away. Caleb stared a moment longer, then kept walking. By late afternoon, the canyon opened slightly, revealing a sloped shelf of rock leading to what looked like a dry basin. They took a break in the shade of a boulder. Benny sank to the ground, breathing hard, while Caleb stretched his legs, scanning the horizon. "We keep going down," he said. "Water usually finds the low ground. Might lead to a stream." Benny didn't answer right away. He was looking at his boots, fingers twitching against the laces. "What if it circles back into the fire?" he said finally. Caleb looked at him. "We saw how fast it moved. We don't even know where the damn thing started." Caleb swallowed. The truth had been creeping in for hours, and now it stood there with them, bold in the sunlight. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know where the fire was headed. And they didn't have a map. Just instinct. Just each other. He looked down the slope. "Then we don't stop," Caleb said. Benny met his eyes, nodded once, and stood. They kept walking. That night, they didn't set up camp. They found a narrow alcove near the canyon wall, shielded on one side by rock. It was tight, barely enough room for them both to sit. They didn't talk. They didn't light anything. They just sat there, listening to the night breathe. And somewhere, far in the distance, the wind carried a low, rolling crackle. Still alive, still burning, still coming. Chapter 7. The fire had not followed them. It had overtaken them. They didn't know it yet. Not fully, not in the way you know a thing when you can see it laid bare before you. But they felt it, in the heat that no longer came from the sun, in the way the wind began to move like it had a purpose, in the stillness that didn't feel like quiet anymore. It felt like a held breath. They woke just before dawn, if you could call what they'd managed to do sleep. Caleb had drifted in and out of a fitful haze, eyes cracked open every time the wind groaned through the dry limbs overhead. Benny hadn't stirred at all. When the exhaustion hit him, it had taken him like a drug. Now he sat up slowly, rubbing grit from his eyes. His voice came out raw. "How long we got before it finds us again?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He was already crouched a few feet from their bedrolls, facing the ridge they'd scrambled down the night before. He'd climbed up partway in the dark, hoping for a glimpse of stars, of clarity. But there was no moon, and there were no stars. Just smoke. Even now it hung above them like a lid, a pale, brown-gray ceiling pressing down on the world. It bled through the tree trunks and stained the rising light, turning it a kind of dull, metallic orange. Caleb didn't say it, but Benny saw the shape of it in his shoulders. Tense, hunched, bracing. "What?" Benny asked quietly. Caleb just said, "It's already close." They didn't pack slowly. By now they were down to the bare essentials: water, food, maps and compass. The rest stayed behind: sleeping bags, spare clothes, anything that didn't serve the next few hours. Their packs were tighter, lighter, but the weight that dragged at them wasn't on their shoulders anymore. It was in their lungs. They moved north again, away from the wind which had shifted violently in the night. It no longer came from a single direction, but swirled, dipping and rushing like a tide. Branches rattled above them, and pine needles fell in little flurries, brittle as ash. Caleb took the lead. Benny followed. They didn't speak much. There was nothing to say that didn't feel pointless or panicked. They aimed for elevation. Not to escape, the fire would find elevation faster than they would, but to see. To find any sign of what lay beyond the folds of the ridgeline they'd dropped into yesterday. With luck, they'd crest a rise and glimpse a valley not yet touched. Maybe even a drainage they could follow down. But luck had stopped listening. By late morning they were staggering. Caleb's legs burned. Benny's lips were cracked and pale. They hadn't rationed water poorly, but it didn't matter. The air stole moisture with every breath. Every word dried their tongues. Around midday they reached the top of a long, shale-strewn climb. The view was wider now. They could see into the next valley over, and their stomachs dropped. It was already burning. Pillars of smoke rose in slow spirals from somewhere just beyond the ridgeline, not full-on flames yet, but smoldering crowns, scorched treetops. "Jesus," Benny whispered. Caleb closed his eyes. "It's ahead of us, too." Benny dropped to sit on a sun-baked boulder, panting. "Are we boxed in?" "No," Caleb said. "Not yet." He pointed west. The land fell in stages that way, plateaus and ridges, some forested, others exposed. Farther out, the terrain turned jagged, like shattered glass. The canyons. "We moved toward the stone," Caleb said. "Fire doesn't like rock. But we don't know what's over there. We know what's behind us." They went west. The descent was brutal. The dry soil slipped underfoot, sending them skidding more than once. Benny fell hard once and caught himself with his wrist, letting out a yell sharp enough to summon echoes. Caleb hauled him up without a word. By afternoon, the trees thinned. They reached a broken escarpment where the forest abruptly stopped and the land dropped away into badland-colored rock, sandstone ridges, dry creek beds, sun-baked gullies like the folds of an ancient brain. The heat hit them like a wall. No shade, no breeze, just exposed earth radiating like a stovetop. But the visibility was better, and the smoke, for now, hadn't reached this far. They picked their way along a crumbling ledge, hugging the wall. One misstep and it was a long drop to nothing. Benny's voice was hoarse when he spoke again. "Water check?" Caleb nodded. They stopped beneath a shallow overhang and shared the last liter between them. 2 more liters total left between both packs. 3 days in, and they were being hunted by something they couldn't outrun and couldn't see until it was already on them. They rested briefly. Then they pressed deeper into the rock country, moving faster now, hearts racing even when they weren't climbing. The land was foreign here, sharp, collapsed. It felt like entering the rib cage of a beast, long dead. But the fire was behind them. At least for now. That night, they didn't make camp so much as collapse. They curled into the shadows of a tall sandstone pillar and tried to breathe through the creeping smoke. Benny coughed in his sleep. Caleb sat with his back against the rock, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. He'd seen the stars again for a moment that evening. Only a few, and only briefly, before the haze swallowed them. But it was enough to remind him of where they should have been. This wasn't supposed to be a story. It was supposed to be a memory. And now, it was becoming a nightmare neither of them would wake up from easily. Chapter 8. They hadn't spoken since dawn. It wasn't that they were angry. It wasn't even tension. Not the kind that came from clashing thoughts or fraying tempers. It was something else entirely. Like they'd both been hollowed out by the hours, by the heat, by the sharp silence of this alien, skeletal place. They didn't speak because there was no strength left to waste on sound. The canyons had turned cruel overnight. The ground beneath them was no longer simply dry. It was desperate. Every step they took slid on scree, scattered rocks crunching underfoot like bones. The ridgelines loomed above them like broken walls, jutting out at odd angles, splitting and rejoining like veins through a diseased heart. Shadows moved strangely here. Some followed them. Others fell against the grain of the sun. By midday, their skin had taken on a strange, grayish pallor. They had retreated into themselves, into the grinding, endless motion of forward. Benny's voice was gone entirely. His lips bled in the corners when he tried to suck moisture from the tiny reservoir of their last shared bottle. Caleb rationed it again, measured sips, counted silently, switching off every half hour. They hadn't seen a living thing in almost 20 hours. Not a rabbit, not a bird, not even a fly. The stillness here wasn't peace. It was purgatory. Their path narrowed through a slot canyon, a narrow gash of shadow where the wind funneled in sideways and brought with it a strange scent. Not fire, not exactly. Something burnt, something old. Benny lifted his head slowly, eyes rimmed in red. "What is that?" Caleb hesitated. His fingers brushed the wall of the canyon. It was warm. Too warm. "I don't know." They moved faster. The slot gave way to a flat, sun-baked shelf that curved along the upper walls of the ravine. From there, they could see far back the way they'd come, at least 2 ridgelines, and the heavy lid of smoke that now smothered the eastern sky. It was thicker than yesterday, darker. It clawed lower, like the back of some rising beast. "It's chasing us," Benny said at last. His voice was nearly unrecognizable. A cracked whisper. Caleb didn't answer. He just kept walking. They were headed for the far edge of the rocky basin, where the land dipped again into a narrow chute. If they followed it right, it might lead them down toward the ravine floor, a deeper gorge they'd glimpsed from a ledge the day before. They hadn't wanted to go that far down, but now it looked like the only place left to hide. They made it to the rim, just as the wind changed again. This time, it hit them like a slap. Hot, sudden, and filled with smoke. Caleb spun around, staring east. For a second, he saw nothing but haze. Then it lifted, and the mountain behind them bloomed with color. Not the soft greens of the forest, not the muted gray of the stone, but red, orange, yellow. Flames. The fire had breached the ridge. "Move!" he shouted, and they ran. Down the rock chute, slipping, scrambling. Benny fell once and slid 5 feet, scraping his palms open. He didn't cry out, just got up again, mouth open wide, gasping for air that now tasted like charcoal. The fire didn't scream, it roared, a sound like a freight train made of teeth and heat. It tore down the ridgeline above them, igniting shrubs in bursts, hurling black ash into the sky like snow turned inside out. They made it to the gorge floor just as the wind punched through the canyon and whipped the trees at its bottom into a frenzy. Dead branches flew sideways. Dust rose in clouds. Somewhere above them, something cracked like a rifle. Caleb yanked Benny toward the shadowed side of a boulder the size of a car. They ducked there, pressed together, both coughing, eyes streaming. "I can't," Benny croaked, choking. "I can't breathe." "Pull your shirt up," Caleb barked. "Cover your mouth." Benny obeyed, and Caleb did the same. For a few seconds they huddled there, both hearts pounding so loud they could hear nothing else. Just the roar, just the wind, just the deep, angry breath of something alive and ravenous. When it passed above them, just over the ridge, everything went quiet again. Not peace. Not yet. but the moment where the axe pauses in midair, just before the swing. Caleb waited until he could hear again. Then he looked at Benny. "We can't stay here." Benny nodded, his shirt still pressed to his face. "We go deeper," Caleb said. "Farther into the rock. Find shade. Wait it out." They moved again. The gorge bent sharply west. They followed it, ducking under overhangs, stepping over collapsed stone, avoiding pockets where dry brush had collected like kindling. They found a narrow split in the canyon wall and squeezed through it into a hollow barely wide enough for their pecs. It stank of sulfur and lichen, but the rock was cool. They stayed there as the world burned just out of view. That night, they didn't speak. They just lay side by side in the crevice, arms brushing, eyes wide open to the dark. Ash fell like black snow, covering the edges of their hiding place, creeping down like soot. Sleep, when it came, was dreamless. Chapter 9. They woke coughing. Not because of the smoke, at least not yet. That would come later. They woke coughing because their throats were raw, their lips cracked, and their chests felt like empty vessels scraped clean. Caleb sat up first and leaned forward, elbows on knees, breathing hard through his nose. Benny stirred moments later and rolled to his side, spitting a thread of phlegm into the dirt. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The heat had arrived before the sunrise did, like it had been waiting for them to open their eyes. They shared a few sips of water, rationed down to mouthfuls now. Then they shouldered their packs and turned their backs on the only sliver of shelter they'd found in hours. The pillar they'd slept beside stood tall and narrow, like the remains of a forgotten cathedral. Caleb glanced back once and then looked forward again. They wouldn't return. The rock country felt endless. There were no trees now, only scrub and stone, long fingers of sandstone and loose, sun-baked gravel. The terrain was hard on their boots and harder on their nerves. Every step took effort, every breath stung, but they didn't stop. They moved west. Sometimes it felt like they were chasing the edge of a dream, always cresting one ridge to see another, every view a copy of the last. The wind had died in the night, and now the world was unnervingly still. No birds, no insects. Even the clouds refused to move. Benny tripped once on a loose patch of shale and stumbled hard to one knee. He hissed, rolled onto his backside and cradled the leg, muttering under his breath. Caleb was there in seconds. "What is it?" Benny shook his head. "Just a bad knock. Didn't twist it. Just hurts." "You sure?" Benny nodded, though his jaw stayed clenched. "Yeah, I can walk." Caleb offered his hand, and Benny took it. They walked slower for a while. Caleb watched Benny out of the corner of his eye, saw the way he favored one leg now, the way he winced without meaning to. He didn't press. They both knew it wouldn't help. By mid-morning, the light had turned sharp and white, the kind that makes you squint even with your eyes closed. Their shadows grew thin and short. Time blurred. The heat was becoming an enemy in its own right. At one point, they found a rock shelf that jutted out like an awning and crouched beneath it to regroup. The stone radiated warmth, even in shadow, like sitting beside an oven. Benny wiped a shaking hand across his forehead. His voice cracked when he spoke. "We're not gonna make it like this." Caleb didn't look at him. "We keep going. To where? Somewhere we can live." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even optimism. It was necessity, the kind of belief you forced yourself to have because the alternative was paralysis. Benny leaned his head back against the rock, eyes closed. "We should have never gone off trail." "We didn't. Not really. The trail ended. We kept walking. Same thing." Caleb finally turned to face him. His eyes weren't angry, just sunken and hollow. You think it'd be better if we were sitting on a marked path right now? You think the fire cares if it's labeled? Benny let out a bitter breath, not quite a laugh. No, I keep thinking how fast it all happened. 1 minute we're hiking and the next... Caleb didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. They left the shade a few minutes later and climbed another rise, this one sharper, almost knife-edged. At the top, Caleb paused, one hand on a slab of stone. Benny joined him slowly, breathing hard. Below them, the land opened up. A canyon. Not one of the deep chasms they'd seen on maps. This was narrower, younger maybe, but it was real. A dry riverbed curled through the bottom like a fossil. The walls were steep in places, but not unclimbable. You thinking what I'm thinking? Benny asked. Caleb nodded. Water had to come from somewhere. Might be shade down there. They descended. The canyon felt like a cradle. Hot, yes, but more sheltered. The air didn't whip at them here. The sun didn't burn quite as directly. They found a bend in the riverbed where the wall curved over slightly, forming a half cave. There, in the dust and silence, they allowed themselves a break. Caleb checked the compass. Benny massaged his leg. It's not swelling, he said quietly. Hurts like hell, but not swelling. Caleb didn't respond. A sound reached them. Faint, high, like a whistle being dragged through thick air. They both froze. Then another sound, deeper, a dull roar, far off but growing. Caleb was on his feet. Benny followed, eyes wide. Smoke rose over the canyon wall behind them. Thick, black, rolling like a tide. Move, Caleb said. They grabbed their packs and ran. The canyon funneled them forward, walls narrowing, then widening again. They dodged around rock falls, leapt narrow gaps, ignored the protests of their bodies. The fire was coming. The sound was monstrous now. Not just wind, not just crackle. It was alive, a heaving, churning breath that wanted to devour. The canyon turned sharply left. They followed, and the smoke behind them vanished for a moment. But they knew better than to think it gone. They kept running. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew what they were running from. Chapter 10. They didn't speak much the next morning. Not out of anger or hopelessness, just out of exhaustion. The kind that didn't clear with sleep, because real sleep hadn't come in 2 nights. It was in their eyes, dull and reluctant in their movements, stripped of all grace. The fire hadn't touched them directly since the second day, but it had been close enough, often enough, that their bodies carried its residue like it was baked into their bones. They moved like ghosts. They had crossed through the ribs of the broken landscape yesterday, but it hadn't ended in safety. It had ended in a steep walled draw lined with jagged, sun-beaten stone, the kind that offered no trail, no water, no kindness. They'd descended into it without knowing it would narrow so quickly. Once inside, the walls tightened around them like the throat of something ancient. They'd had no choice but to bed down inside the chute and hope nothing came crawling from the dark. Now they climbed out, limbs trembling. The rock face was slick with sand and broken pieces of shale, but Caleb found purchase. He led the way, then turned and reached down for Benny. Benny's fingers slipped once, but he caught the edge again and hauled himself upward with a grunt. The top was flat, open, another bluff of parched stone blistered with sun and rimmed with low brush. The forest was long behind them now, nothing but a charcoal haze on the far eastern horizon. But in its place was something just as brutal. Silence. Not peace, just the still, heavy quiet of a dead land. No wind, no birds, no insects even, just heat. They stood side by side, squinting against the glare. Benny shielded his face with one hand. What now? Caleb scanned the landscape. a slow turn. He pointed south by southwest toward a series of crooked gullies that looked less eroded than the ones behind them. They carved through the stone like veins, some wider, some narrow. "There," he said, "low enough to hide. Maybe it'll funnel us towards water. Or straight into a box canyon. Then we climb again." Benny gave a breathy laugh. "I'm starting to think your plan is just go until we die somewhere different. Better than dying in one place." They walked. The sun climbed. The air thinned. There were no trees anymore, just scrubby brush that crumbled to dust when touched. The trail wasn't a trail, just a hopeful descent. The gullies were tricky, some easier to traverse, others filled with loose scree and sudden drop-offs. The stone was sharper here. Sometimes the path forced them to sidestep along walls like tightropes. Caleb cut his palm once catching a fall. Benny banged his shin so hard he screamed. The canyon gave his voice back in a hollow, dispassionate echo. They were slowing. Not just because of the terrain, but because of what it was doing to them. Caleb's muscles trembled with every climb. Benny coughed more often now, and every time he glanced at the horizon with haunted eyes, like he expected the smoke to answer. Their water was low, less than half a liter each. By late afternoon, the air began to shimmer, not just from heat, but something else, an instability that warned of change. The light dimmed slightly, but not from clouds. From above, the sky had started to stain yellowish-gray again. Caleb stopped abruptly on a sloping ledge. Benny came up behind him and froze too. Far in the distance, just past the horizon where the gullies dropped into deeper country, a plume had risen. Fire, not smoke from before. This was new, rising vertically, strong, driven. Benny swallowed. It caught up. "No, this is different." Caleb stared. "It's a second front." How does that happen?" "Wind changes, spot fires. New ignition point, could be anything." He didn't say it could be lightning, but the sky had been dry for days. So it meant something else. Something closer. They didn't wait to guess. They cut west again, abandoning the smoother descent. It was slower going, up and over a tilted ridge. The heat didn't just lean on them now. It pulled. Sweat didn't come anymore. They'd stopped making it. Their bodies were conserving everything. As they reached the top of the ridge, Benny stumbled and went to his knees. He stayed there, head bowed, breathing hard. He croaked. "Caleb, I need a minute." Caleb hesitated, then crouched beside him. He pulled a rag from his pack and wetted it with the last mouthful from his bottle. He handed it over silently. Benny took it with shaking hands, pressed it to his neck. "We're getting close," Caleb said, trying to believe it. Benny opened one eye. "To what?" Caleb didn't answer. The ridge ended in another drop, a sheer cut that spilled into a broken basin of cliffs and boulders. But in the far corner, half shielded by a fold in the rock, there was a darker patch, a shadow, and within it, the glint of something smoother than stone. "Look," Caleb said. Benny followed his gaze. "Water?" "Maybe." They moved again. The descent was worse than anything before. Steep, unsteady. Benny slipped twice more. Caleb had to wedge his boots into a crack and haul him upright one-handed. But they made it. The basin was a dry wash that had once held more. But there, tucked into the side where shadows lingered, was a pothole. A rock basin filled with rainwater, or maybe snowmelt that had survived the heat under shade. They didn't care. They dropped to their knees and drank with their hands first, then rationed more carefully, then drank again. It tasted like minerals, like dirt, like life. When they leaned back, gasping, the sun had begun to drop, and the second fire still climbed. They would have to move again, but not yet. For now, they were still breathing, still on their feet. And the gorge hadn't swallowed them whole. Not yet. Chapter 11. The sandstone had started to pulse, not literally, but after hours of crossing the same raw ridges, gullies, and blind ravines, it no longer felt static. Heat shimmered off every surface in visible waves, and the reflected sunlight struck their skin like a physical force. Every rock glared like a blade. The land seemed to bend and ripple ahead of them as if it were breathing. Tight, shallow, uneven. Caleb barely noticed when he started walking with a limp. His right ankle had taken a bad roll on a talus slope earlier that morning, but he'd tightened his laces and said nothing. Benny noticed anyway. He didn't say a word about it either. They didn't need to add more truths to the pile. The ones they already carried were heavy enough. The fire was no longer behind them. It was all around. Not in the immediate vicinity, not invisible tongues or towering plumes. But the sky had darkened with soot, and the scent of burning bark came on every gust. The sun showed only as a copper stain overhead. They hadn't seen clear sky since yesterday morning. Midday passed without discussion. They had stopped talking unless it was necessary. Every syllable tasted like ash. Even Benny, usually the first to crack a joke to fill dead space, stayed silent. He had started touching the lucky coin on his necklace again, almost compulsively. Caleb had seen it once in high school, a gift from Benny's older brother, who'd taken off for California and hadn't been heard from since. They walked. They drank. They walked more. When the ground dropped again into a new canyon, they followed it. It offered no shade, but it gave them a clear direction. Down. By late afternoon, their skin had taken on a tight red sheen. Not sunburn exactly. The sun had been filtered through smoke for too long. But heat burn. Their shirts clung to their backs with salt and grime. Blisters had formed beneath their socks and dried like cracked leather. Every step was a negotiation. "Stop," Benny said finally, voice thin, "just for a sec." Caleb slowed. Benny leaned hard into a shadow beneath a broken rock overhang, hands on his knees. Caleb watched his shoulders rise and fall, shallow, stuttering. Not just fatigue. The panic was clawing again. It came in waves. They both felt it. "You dizzy?" Caleb asked. "Yeah," Benny forced to swallow. "I keep thinking we've been here before." "We haven't. It just all looks the same." Benny nodded. Then his hand slipped down to his hip, where the second-to-last water bottle clung in a mesh pocket. "Should we?" Caleb hesitated, then pulled it out and passed it over. Half. Benny drank, passed it back. Caleb tipped the bottle, took a long drag, and tucked it away again. It wasn't going to last another day. They kept moving. By dusk, the canyon widened again and split off into a narrow draw that showed more signs of wind. Cracked tree trunks, old fire scars, bare roots clawing from the dirt like hands. The path ahead curved out of sight. Then they heard it. Not the fire, not yet, but something worse. Wind. Real wind, fast and furious and full of heat. It funneled down the draw and hit them like an animal, carrying smoke so thick it stung the eyes. Benny doubled over, coughing, one hand clamped over his mouth. Caleb turned his face and squinted. That smell. It was fresher, closer. "Turn around," Caleb said immediately. Benny didn't question. They spun and started up the incline they'd just descended, forcing their aching legs to climb again. The air followed them, pushing like an invisible tide. They reached the top of the draw just as the far end of it flickered. The fire had breached the basin. This time, they saw it. It wasn't the slow crawl of flames licking underbrush. It was a wall of gold and red and violent orange erupting from the mouth of the canyon, feeding off the dry sage and skeletal trees like they were soaked in gasoline. Heat blistered the air in a low roar. Caleb's heart nearly stopped. Go. They didn't argue. They sprinted. No more strategy. No more route planning. Just escape. Back into the rock country. Down another ledge. Across another fractured wash. Everything burned behind them. The sky darkened again until it looked like dusk, though the sun hadn't yet set. They ran until they couldn't, until their legs buckled beneath them and they collapsed behind a steep stone rise, sheltered for now. Benny lay on his back, gasping, throat raw. That was it, man. That was the one that gets us. Caleb pressed his forehead to the rock, still too stunned to answer, because he wasn't sure it wasn't. Chapter 12. There was a moment, sometime around mid-morning, when Caleb nearly lost Benny. They had followed the dry wash for hours, picking through soft sand and fist-sized rocks, descending deeper into the network of arroyos and slick rock. The day had started warmer than the last, and it only grew hotter, the kind of heat that didn't feel like air so much as an invisible weight pressing down. Caleb felt it behind his eyes, inside his chest, clamping tight. He didn't say anything. Neither did Benny, not until Benny stumbled, caught himself, and then went down on one knee. Caleb turned. Hey! Benny raised a hand, trying to wave him off, but his other hand was braced on the ground and shaking. Just give me a second. Caleb dropped beside him, pulled out the bottle. We need to cool you down. No water. We have a little. Benny didn't argue. Caleb poured a splash over the back of Benny's neck, then pressed his own hands against it, letting the water soak in. Benny's skin was hot, not sweaty, just hot. Heat exhaustion. Caleb looked up at the canyon walls. They were steep here, baking in the sun. No shade for another 100 yards, maybe more. He cursed under his breath. We're not far from that split, he said. There was a shelf above the last bend. If we can climb up to it, we might get a breeze. Benny didn't move. Come on, Caleb said more urgently. You're not stopping here. With effort, Benny nodded. He pulled his legs under him and pushed to his feet. Caleb steadied him, then led the way, cutting across the stream bed to the wall. The shelf wasn't high, 6 feet, maybe 7, but they were weak, and the rock was slick with fine dust. Caleb went first, scrambling up and flattening against the upper ledge. Then he reached back and hauled Benny up by the arm. Benny grunted in pain, his wrist flaring again, but didn't complain. They collapsed in the thin shadow. A breeze did stir here, faint but real. It wasn't cool, but it moved, and that was enough. For a long time they didn't speak. Benny's breathing slowed. Caleb watched the canyon beyond, trying to read the patterns in the smoke curling into the sky. It was rising from 2 separate sources now, one behind them and one far ahead, deeper in the rock country. They were walking a razor's edge. They waited until the heat began to dip, early evening maybe. Then they moved again, slower, more careful. Benny was drinking in small sips. Caleb kept him talking, quietly, asking him questions about nothing. What movie he wanted to see when they got out, what his first meal back would be. Cheeseburger, Benny said. Fries. Milkshake so cold it gives me a headache. Caleb smiled faintly. You've thought this through. I've been dying for a milkshake since hour 2. Caleb didn't say what he was thinking, that it had been nearly 70 hours now. 3 full days. They reached the next basin by dusk. This one was deeper, carved into layers of red and white sandstone. Somewhere, long ago, water had run here in earnest. Now it was just a fossil, a memory of a river. They followed its curve, noting dry channels and debris piled high along the banks, evidence of flash floods. "We don't sleep down here," Caleb said. Benny nodded. "Not unless we want to wake up swimming." They found a place to climb out, a narrow cut in the wall that led up to a flat-top bluff. It took almost all their remaining strength. At the top, they lay gasping. The stars came out slowly. The smoke was thinner tonight, maybe a shift in the wind. For the first time since the fire started, they could see a slice of sky. "I almost forgot what it looked like," Benny murmured. Caleb looked at him. Benny's eyes were half-lidded, his skin pale in the starlight. But he was still here. "I didn't." They ate a few bites of jerky, shared the last third of a liter between them. The silence was companionable. Not hopeful exactly, but not hopeless either. In the middle of the night, Caleb woke to the smell of smoke again. Faint. New. He sat up slowly, heart hammering, and scanned the horizon. Far to the north, the sky flickered, a glow just barely visible over the rim of a canyon. Another fire, or the same one, pushing forward. He didn't wake Benny. Not yet. Let him sleep a little longer. But in the dark, Caleb marked the direction. And in his head, he began to map a new path. Chapter 13. By morning, the gorge had taken on a new shape. The smoke was thinner, not gone, but ghost-like now. A gauzy haze clinging to the upper reaches of the sky, like a memory the wind hadn't quite finished carrying away. They were able to breathe easier, though their lungs still rasped when they talked. Caleb's voice had dropped to a gravelly growl, and Benny's laugh, when it came, sounded like paper tearing. But it came. That was something. They hadn't slept well. The rock they'd curled up beside had radiated heat all night, like the earth itself had absorbed the fire's rage and was still trying to let it go. Their backs ached, their shoulders twitched from every sound. But they were alive. The fire hadn't found them again. At least, not yet. Caleb stood first. He didn't speak, just started repacking the essentials, same as always. He moved like he'd already done the math. Already made the call that today would be forward motion again, not hesitation. Benny sat rubbing his temples for a long time before rising. "How long you think we've got?" Benny finally asked. Caleb looked at the horizon. The light was clearer, whiter. The smoke hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. That mattered. "Long enough to keep going," Caleb said. They moved west again, deeper into the unfamiliar ridgelines, choosing elevation and stone when they could, shade when it was there. The sun was sharper today, not blocked by soot anymore. It cut shadows hard across the terrain and made every exposed surface shimmer. Their sweat dried almost as quickly as it formed. By midday, they hit another dead end. The canyon narrowed abruptly into a sheer chute, walls rising steep and sudden, the path ahead a vertical descent impossible without ropes. Caleb tested the drop with a few kicked stones and watched them disappear into silence. "Nope," he muttered. "Not the way." Benny coughed and leaned against a flat slab of sun-warmed rock. "Can we go around?" They backtracked 50 yards and started scaling a side ledge. It was narrow and jagged, forcing them to crawl at points. Caleb's knuckles split open against the sandstone. Benny scraped his knee so hard it bled through the fabric, but they made it around the drop. When they reconnected with the base of the gorge, the terrain flattened into a dry wash lined with boulders the size of compact cars. The air was quieter here, more still. The wind hadn't reached this place in hours, maybe more. That silence made them stop. Benny looked around. "Why's it feel like we're being watched?" Caleb didn't answer. He just turned slowly in a circle, reading the land the way he used to read maps. intuitively, searching for inconsistencies. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But it was something. They pushed on. An hour later, they found signs of life. Old ones, a rusted camping stove, a shredded tarp flapping on a bent frame. No people, no gear worth salvaging, but it meant others had passed through this place once. That gave them a strange kind of hope. Caleb looked at the remains. Whoever they were, they had to leave too. Think they made it? I think we have to. They ate sparingly. Trail mix, dried fruit, water sipped from cupped palms. Benny's hands were shaking now. The fatigue was catching up, deep in his bones. His calves cramped when he crouched. His breath whistled when he stood. Caleb saw it, but didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Instead, he took more weight from Benny's pack and carried it himself. The gorge narrowed again around late afternoon. The walls pressed in close, blotting out chunks of sky. The light changed, more gold than white now, less punishing, but it felt like a trick. The wind returned, warm and dry, carrying scents they couldn't place. Not smoke exactly, but close. The fire was moving, just not toward them, for now. When they stopped for the night, they found a narrow alcove beneath a jagged shelf of stone. It was barely enough space for both of them to lie flat, but it kept them out of the open. Caleb gathered dry brush for insulation. Benny just sat, head in his hands. His voice broke the silence eventually. I keep thinking about that last day, before we came out here. Caleb didn't answer, just leaned back against the wall beside him. I didn't think about anything, you know, Benny went on. Didn't pack right, didn't charge my phone. I just went along for the hike. Figured we'd come back with sunburns and bug bites. Caleb looked at him. You didn't plan for a forest fire? Benny laughed dryly. Guess not. They sat in silence a long time. Eventually, Caleb said, If we get out of this, when? Caleb nodded. When we get out of this, I think I'll stop pretending like everything's fine all the time. Benny looked over, startled. What? I don't know. Just been holding too much in. For too long. Stuff I don't even think about until it's quiet like this. Same, Benny said softly. I thought I was doing okay. I think I was wrong. They didn't try to sleep right away. The night was still warm, the stone beneath them hot to the touch. But when exhaustion pulled them under, they let it. The silence of the gorge stretched around them, huge and hollow. And above them, the stars returned. For the first time in 3 nights, they could see them. Chapter 14. They were past the point of lying to themselves. The fire was no longer something they might escape. It had become something they had to outrun. There was no fixed direction anymore, no clear route back to safety, no known feature on the map they could scramble toward and name safe. They were moving because stopping meant death. They were climbing, crawling, sliding their way over terrain so broken it barely held shape. Benny hadn't said anything in hours. Caleb didn't press him. Words took breath. Breath took water. Water was gone. They crested a bluff sometime mid-morning, dry wind snapping at their backs, and found themselves on a narrow saddle of land between 2 gouged-out ravines. Smoke poured like ink across the far end, and they didn't need to guess what it meant. The fire was flanking them. It had split and curled, following not just their path, but the terrain's curves. Caleb studied the land ahead. Jagged formations rose like teeth, their bases sunken into deeper canyons. One of those chasms looked passable. It veered right, angling west toward a long escarpment that might provide a ledge or passage beneath the fire line. He pointed. Benny nodded. Down they went. It took over an hour to reach the floor of the new ravine. The descent scraped skin and battered their legs. They took turns lowering each other, using tree roots and jutting stones like a ladder. Every muscle burned. When they finally dropped the last 10 feet onto the dry creek bed below, Benny collapsed fully. Caleb didn't sit. He was listening. The wind was coming from the canyon now. That was bad. That meant the fire was above them. He looked up. Sky blotted out, orange haze thick and boiling. Then he looked ahead. The canyon funneled forward, tightening in places until it almost became a slot. Shadows swam along the high sandstone walls. They had no choice. They moved. The deeper they went, the cooler the air grew, but not in a comforting way. It was a heavy, unnatural chill, the kind that came when sunlight couldn't reach and smoke sank like fog. Their lungs fought for every inhale. Breathing through sleeves helped. Barely. Twice they heard the fire crack. It wasn't a normal sound. Not trees popping, not underbrush catching. It was a detonation. Somewhere high above them, pockets of superheated gas exploded in the canopy, sending shock waves through the upper ravines. Bits of charred bark and white ash floated down like snow. They didn't talk about what might happen if one of those blasts reached down into their narrow corridor. The canyon tightened again. The floor rose in stepped ledges, an ancient water path. They climbed them one by one, Benny nearly falling twice. He didn't curse, he didn't complain, but he moved slower now. Caleb kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see him on his knees. Eventually they reached a fork. The left passage was dry, dark, narrow, a crack more than a path. The right, wider, smoother, but already catching smoke. They hesitated. Then Caleb pulled Benny left. The crack was brutal, barely shoulder width. They had to turn sideways, pushing through with scraping hips and packs held over their heads. Once, Caleb got wedged and had to exhale fully to slip through. But the air inside that narrow stone rib was cleaner. The rock was cooler. It felt like the inside of something older than the fire. By late afternoon, they emerged, scraped, panting, eyes red and bodies coated in fine dust. The passage had dumped them onto a ledge hanging above another canyon, one less steep but just as sun-blasted. The smoke was thinner here, but they were out of water, out of food. Caleb crouched and stared out over the empty stretch of wilderness. Far, far to the northwest, a wall of smoke rose in a curved column. Somewhere under that haze, the fire raged. But they had, at least for now, stayed ahead of the teeth. Behind him, Benny slumped against the wall. "I keep thinking," Benny rasped, "about what I was doing the morning we left. You know, what my last normal morning was." Caleb looked at him. "I made a cup of coffee," Benny said. "Tried to fix my mom's porch light. It was busted. I think I told her I'd finish it after the trip." Caleb sat down beside him. "You will." "Yeah." Benny leaned his head back, eyes half-lidded. "But not how I thought." They didn't speak again for a long time. Night didn't fall so much as arrive. No sunset, just a gradual smothering of light. Smoke curled overhead like a roof, but the stars tried, faint and flickering. Caleb stared up at them, feeling hollowed out. 3 nights. 3 nights of running, clawing, crawling, sweating, choking, praying. He didn't know what they had left. He didn't know if this land would spare them, if they'd ever see a road or trailhead again. He didn't even know if help still could reach them. But he knew one thing. They were still moving. And the fire hadn't taken them yet. Chapter 15. It rained. Only for a few minutes. a spit of wind and sizzle that barely touched the ground before it steamed away. But for Caleb and Benny, crouched together in the shadows of a ravine they hadn't meant to find, it was enough to make them feel something like human again. It wasn't even a true downpour, more like the exhausted remnants of a storm that had broken apart far away, dragged here by chance and smoke and the whims of a sky that still hadn't made up its mind. The wind came in with it, rattling the ash from the canyon ledges, shifting the clouds overhead like curtains being tugged loose. Caleb didn't move at first. He just tilted his head back and let it hit him. Cool streaks over dry skin, a breath pulled deep into the back of his throat. He didn't realize how long he'd gone without blinking until a droplet ran straight into his eye. Benny, half curled beside him on a sloped patch of stone, whispered, "You crying, or is it just a miracle?" Caleb smiled faintly. Probably both. They didn't know what time it was. They didn't know how far they'd come or how close they were to anything that might save them. But for the moment, it didn't matter. The heat had relented, the sky had wept, and for 30 glorious seconds, the fire behind them didn't feel like the end of the world. They moved again when the wind shifted. The walls of the ravine were narrow, burned black in places where lightning had once danced. The rock was old, banded with time, brittle in ways that made every footfall a quiet negotiation. They didn't speak unless they had to. The ravine was too echoey, too enclosed, like sound would travel straight back to the thing hunting them. Because the fire was hunting them. Not in the way a person might hunt, with malice or intent, but in the way a wave consumes a shore, with hunger and inevitability. Benny lagged behind more often now. His steps had grown uneven, his balance sloppier. Caleb could see it, the way he leaned too hard on his right side, the way his left arm stayed stiff and too close to his ribs. "You hiding something?" Caleb asked gently. Benny made a face like a shrug, but it didn't finish. "Landed weird when I tripped yesterday." "Broke it?" "Don't think so. Just hurts like hell." They paused long enough to adjust the weight of Benny's pack. Caleb took some of it, redistributing it between his own shoulders and Benny's good side. He didn't ask if Benny could keep going. There wasn't an alternative. The ravine bent westward by early afternoon. The floor rose slightly, choked with debris. Twisted logs, branches, flat stones crumbled like sunburnt skin. They climbed over it all with hands and knees and careful footwork, emerging at last into a wider basin surrounded by sheer rock on every side. And there, for the first time in days, they saw water. It wasn't much, just a pool fed by a thread-thin seep coming down from a crack in the wall, but it was enough. They scrambled to it and drank without speaking, hands cupped like pilgrims. The taste was stale and mineral-heavy, but it was cold, and it didn't burn going down. They filled what bottles they could. Then they lay flat in the shade, letting the heat pass over them, just for an hour, just long enough to remember what not running felt like. Caleb stared up at the canyon rim above, tracing patterns in the stone. "I keep thinking, if we'd just turned left instead of right that first day, we'd be just as screwed," Benny said, his eyes still closed. "You don't think there was a better way out? I think it doesn't matter anymore." The honesty of it quieted them both. Later, they pressed on again. They followed the narrowing gorge westward, the stone bending in strange ways now, curving and splitting, like the earth itself had melted once and solidified mid-collapse. Sometimes they had to climb. Sometimes they had to backtrack and drop into a new corridor. They were deeper now than either of them realized. The walls were so high they blotted out most of the sky. Even the smoke seemed to hesitate here, uncertain how to fall. The air was hotter again, but still breathable. For now. Night came without fanfare. The light drained from above like someone wringing color from a cloth. By the time they found a place to stop, their legs trembled with each step. They didn't eat that night, just water and silence. And when Benny finally spoke, it was without his usual lilt. "Do you think they're looking for us?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then, "They will." The silence after that was not entirely hopeless. It was the silence of belief without proof, of waiting, of faith clung to by fingernails. Neither of them said what they feared most, that the smoke they outran might have already reached where they came from, that the fire might have closed the roads, that no one would know which direction they ran. But in the dark, beneath a canopy of stone and soot, they listened for planes, for voices, for something louder than their own ragged hearts. They heard nothing. Still, they stayed alive. And in this place, that was enough. Chapter 16. They broke camp before the sun was up. Not that there had been much of a camp. Just two figures curled in the partial shelter of an outcrop, cloaked in a haze of exhaustion. Caleb's back ached from the rock he'd slept against. Benny had a cough now, not constant, but dry, tight, and coming in short bursts that made him wince each time it surfaced. Neither of them mentioned it. Talking had become something reserved for essential things: directions, danger, water. Dawn was a bruised gray, the sky smeared in a layer of smoke so thick it filtered the light before it even reached the earth. The sun, when it finally clawed its way over the horizon, looked more like a dying ember than the fireball they once welcomed. Heat followed quickly. "Northwest," Caleb muttered, voice cracking. He tapped the compass, checked the map again. Not that the map helped much anymore. The landmarks had stopped matching up with what they were seeing a day ago. Benny nodded. His eyes were puffy, his skin windburned and smudged with dirt, but he still moved, still carried his pack, still matched Caleb step for step without complaint. The canyon floor narrowed as they followed it west, walls gradually tightening into a sandstone throat. At first, it felt like a gift, shade finally, and reprieve from the burning sky, but soon it turned stifling. The heat didn't escape down here, it collected. The stone acted like a kiln, radiating heat from every angle. By late morning, they were soaked in sweat. Caleb's shirt clung to his back like gauze. Benny's cough came back in jagged bursts. The water they had left sloshed quietly in a bottle, 1/2 a liter at most. Rationing had turned into drops on the tongue. It wasn't just the fire anymore. It was the land, the heat, the ache in their legs, their lungs, their eyes. They came to a place where the canyon forked. One path climbed steeply toward more broken rock, the other dipped into a narrow chute that disappeared around a bend. "We don't know where that one leads," Benny rasped. "We don't know where either leads. I just mean, that one's steeper." Caleb looked at both options, sweat dripping from his nose. Then he pointed to the left, the narrower path. "If we can get into a slot, maybe the smoke won't sink into it. And if it's a dead end, then we backtrack." They chose the chute. It narrowed fast. Within 100 feet, the walls were only 6 feet apart. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen stone. But it was cooler. The rock cast deep shadows, and the wind didn't touch them here. For a while, it almost felt survivable. Then they heard it. A crack, not close, not yet, but distinct, not a branch, not wind, the sound of a tree splitting under heat. They froze. Caleb instinctively reached for Benny's shoulder. Both of them turned toward the sound, back the way they'd come. Smoke was rolling in. Slow creeping tendrils at first, then thicker. It came around the bend behind them like fog, but darker, heavier. "No," Benny whispered. Caleb turned. Go. They ran. The chute twisted, slanted downward, the footing treacherous and wet in places, underground moisture seeping through the rock. They scrambled, slid, clawed their way down through the shadows. The smoke followed, growing thicker with each second, seeping in from above like it had a will of its own. Benny tripped once and skinned his knee, but he didn't stop. Caleb hauled him up and they kept moving, lungs screaming now, eyes watering. The air was no longer air, it tasted of ash and memory. And then, just when the darkness became unbearable, the chute widened again. They spilled out onto a ledge, high above a bowl-shaped expanse of canyon. It was stark, raw, but it was open. They dropped to their knees. Caleb sucked in a ragged breath, coughed hard, then forced himself to his feet. Benny sat blinking in the sunlight, shoulders shaking. Smoke still boiled behind them, but the wind shifted, finally, pushing it east. They watched the sky, both silently pleading for the same thing. "Caleb," Benny said, voice hoarse, "we can't keep running blind." "I know. No water, no bearings. I know." It wasn't anger. It was desperation. Caleb looked out over the bowl. Then his eyes narrowed. He pointed to a notch in the far canyon wall. "Maybe that's a pass, if we can get over it." Benny nodded. "Then let's go before the wind turns again." They stood, moved, one foot, then another, no longer racing the fire. Now they were racing time. Chapter 17. The morning came gray. Not from cloud cover, but smoke, thick and suffocating, rolled across the upper ridges like a storm front. The rising sun barely pierced it, reduced to a dull red smear bleeding through the haze. Caleb stared at it from where he stood, shoes dusted in ash, hands hanging limply at his sides. They hadn't slept much, just dozed in shifts beneath the narrow sandstone overhang they'd found. It hadn't been shelter so much as delay. One more hour where the fire couldn't reach them yet, but it would. Caleb had stopped pretending otherwise. "Benny," he said quietly. No answer. Caleb turned. Benny was still curled near the back of the overhang, eyes shut but twitching. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the chill. The smoke irritated the throat, the lungs, the eyes. Benny's skin had turned pale beneath the grime, and his lips were cracked so badly that one had split during the night. Caleb crouched next to him. "Time to move." Benny stirred but didn't speak, just nodded faintly and forced himself up with stiff arms. His pack had grown lighter over the last few days. Too light. They were nearly out of water. No more food. Everything unnecessary had been stripped away. The body followed suit. They moved through the stone country like ghosts. Thin, silent, always leaning forward as if their weight would drag them toward safety faster than their legs could carry them. They were deeper into the gorge system now. It was no longer just badlands and gullies. Now it was a maze. Narrow passageways cut by ancient water, sheer rock walls rising 50 feet on either side. The canyons twisted back on themselves, turned blind. Sound bounced unpredictably. More than once, Caleb heard what he thought was the snap of branches or the hiss of wind, only to realize it was his own footstep, returned to him a second late. They came to a split. Caleb hesitated. One canyon veered left, dark and steep. The other sloped down, but the walls were tighter. A breath of wind stirred through it, and with it came heat. Benny leaned against the wall, breathing shallowly. "Not that one." "No," Caleb agreed. They took the left. The passage narrowed quickly, and they were forced to walk sideways, scraping their packs against the stone. It was like crawling through a throat. Benny began to cough again. Not a dry tickle, but deep, racking bursts that doubled him over. Caleb paused, looked back. "You good?" Benny lifted a thumb, then wiped blood from his lip. The walls began to widen again. They emerged into a wider basin, still rimmed by rock, but open to the sky. Above them, a break in the smoke let through a brief shaft of sunlight. Benny dropped to his knees in the dirt. "Gimme." 5. Caleb let him rest. He moved a little farther out, scanning the ridges. The higher terrain was still choked in smoke, but he saw movement. Not fire, not birds. Something slow and distant, barely visible through the haze. A plane. He blinked hard, not trusting it. But it passed again. A fixed-wing craft flying low, zigzagging a search pattern. Caleb's chest slammed with adrenaline. He turned back to Benny. "Hey, we might have a shot." Benny looked up, eyes glassy. "Shot at what?" "Signal. Rescue." Caleb reached for his pack, rifled through it. They had no flares, no mirrors, but he had a length of mylar blanket folded flat. He sprinted to the center of the clearing and threw it wide. The silver foil shimmered in the sun. Caleb angled it skyward, flaring it like a flag. Then he took off his jacket, bright orange, and waved it overhead. The plane didn't come back immediately. Seconds turned into minutes. Caleb felt his muscles go rigid. Benny didn't speak. The only sound was the wind building again, rattling through the rocks like distant drums. Then it came back. Lower this time. Closer. The roar of the engine echoed off the canyon walls. The plane banked, circled, dipped a wing. It saw them. Benny collapsed backward, laughing in broken sobs. Caleb didn't allow himself to feel anything yet. The fire was still somewhere behind them. But now, for the first time in 3 days, someone else knew. The plane circled once more and vanished beyond the ridge. A moment later, the low chop of rotors rumbled in the distance. Help was coming. Chapter 18. They didn't talk about the heat anymore. It had become something other than heat, less a sensation, more a presence, an entity that pressed against them with every step, that watched them from every ridge. It filled the gaps between their bones. It made their skin feel like paper, ready to tear. The air wasn't just hot, it was wrong, heavy, sour, metallic. The smell of scorched earth and evaporated sweat and something deeper, more ancient. Burned stone. By mid-morning, they were in open country. The cliffs had split into shelves, shallow washes carving down between them like veins, brittle with dust. Caleb walked in silence. Benny limped behind, his right foot wrapped in strips of his spare shirt. The blister had torn open 2 days ago. Now the skin beneath looked raw and angry, but there was no time to rest it. They were out of water. Not low, not nearly empty. Out. Caleb had known it since the night before. He'd felt the weight of the bottles and lied to himself. This morning there'd been a sip each. Less than a swallow. That was hours ago. Now every thought felt like a slow drag across sandpaper. Benny's breathing was thin behind him. "How much farther, you think?" Caleb didn't answer. They'd followed the stone ridges west as long as they could, but by now they'd been forced down into the drainage again, a cracked arroyo choked with sand and loose rock. It curved in long, meandering hooks, funneling them forward with no clear sense of destination. There was a rhythm to it now, a kind of surrender. Move, breathe, step, ignore the pain, don't fall, don't look back. A breeze kicked up and blew through the canyon, hotter than before. It carried a smell that froze them both. Smoke. Thicker this time, not the background haze that had stalked them for days. This was fresh, close. Benny bent double. No, come on." Caleb turned slowly. He looked toward the cliffs they'd come down from, and for the first time since the ridge, he saw it. Flames. A wall of them, chewing down the horizon. They weren't red or orange. They were white, laced with veins of blue. Crown fire, explosive, crowning the tops of the tallest trees and skipping down canyon faster than any man could run. "Move," Caleb said. "Now." He grabbed Benny by the arm and hauled him upright. No more drainage. No more following the path of least resistance. They scrambled up the left wall of the wash, boots slipping in sand and dust, hands grabbing at brittle roots. They gained 20 feet of elevation. 30. 40. The fire's roar grew louder. It wasn't a sound like wind or trees. It was a freight train through gravel, a roar with a pulse. The heat hit them in waves. They reached the top of a sandstone shelf and ran. No plan, just away. The landscape unfurled like a nightmare. Rock domes and narrow fins. Slabs split by erosion. Nowhere to hide. Nothing to shield them. Caleb looked for gaps, for fissures, for anything that might take them underground or between stone. But it was all sun-baked rock. Benny stumbled again. "I can't." "Yes, you can." "I can't." Caleb stopped, whirled. He grabbed Benny's shirt and yanked him close. Their foreheads nearly touched. "Then crawl." And Benny did. For half a mile they pushed, crawling, walking, dragging, until at last the land split. A narrow slot, vertical walls, maybe 30 feet high, cutting into the earth like a wound. Too small to be marked on a map, too hidden to be seen from above. They dropped in without thinking. It was barely wide enough to move through. Caleb squeezed sideways in places, dragging Benny behind him. The air was stifling, but there was no wind. That meant no flames. Yet. They reached a wider point and collapsed. Both men on their backs, limbs spread, gasping like fish. The fire raged overhead. They could hear it. The canyon acted like a speaker, amplifying the roar. The temperature spiked and then dipped. Ash fell like snow. They didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe hours. There was no sun in here, no way to tell. Eventually, Caleb sat up. His skin was gray with soot. His voice, when it came, sounded like it came from somewhere else. "I think we made it." Benny didn't answer. He was conscious, barely. His eyes flicked to Caleb, then closed again. They spent the night curled in that crack of earth, the firestorm roaring past just out of reach. They weren't safe. Not really. But they weren't burning. And that was enough. Chapter 19. The wrong turn was quiet, but it never felt small. They didn't know they had made a mistake until hours later. It started the way most mistakes do, under pressure, with the heat behind them and the cliffs in front of them, when the only thing that mattered was forward. Caleb's compass was useless now, more sentimental than scientific. Smoke blanketed the sky thick enough to obscure the sun, making shadows feel like illusions. Every direction felt south. But they moved. That was the only rule now. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't breathe too deep. By late morning, they found themselves inside a narrow defile of rock. Walls rising like open jaws, the path beneath their feet sloping steadily down. At first, it seemed promising. The air moved cooler between the stone. Their feet hit firmer ground. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling in his ribs, like his body knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. It didn't feel like a way out. It felt like a way in. "Think this drops into a canyon?" Benny asked as they paused beside a dry patch of sage. Caleb didn't answer at first. His chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. "It's the only lead we've got." And that was true. They'd left behind the last ridge that offered any line of sight. Everything ahead of them now was rock and shadow, The fire had vanished from view, but not from memory. It was still out there, painting the wind with heat. They just couldn't see it anymore. They pressed deeper. The gulch narrowed. Each bend in the trail felt tighter, more uncertain. The walls drew closer together until Caleb could stretch his arms and graze both sides. It wasn't until the third tight switchback that the trail dipped hard and steep, sloping into a serpentine cut of sandstone that dropped with each twist. A dry creek bed. Benny's voice cut through the stillness. "We're dropping into a slot." Caleb nodded, gaze drifting along the walls. "We'll follow it until it flattens. If it doesn't, we turn around." But they didn't. They couldn't. The descent grew more severe, and the rock underfoot smoother, glassy in places from ages of water carving through. They used their hands more than once. Benny slipped on a grain-polished slab and landed hard on his hip. He cursed, rolled, and caught his breath through grit teeth. "You good?" Caleb asked. "Yeah, just bruised, or maybe that's just what it feels like to still be alive." They moved slower now, steadier. It was nearly mid-afternoon when the gulch finally leveled into a winding corridor of pale stone. The canyon floor cracked and broken but walkable. A small joy. A false one. The air here was dead still. No wind, no birds. Even their footfalls sounded muted, swallowed by the height of the walls. Caleb reached out once and touched the canyon's side. Warm. Warmer than it should have been. It pulsed with the sun's memory. Something about it felt wrong. They walked half a mile more before they saw the smoke again, this time in front of them. Benny stopped in his tracks. How the hell? The canyon curved gently to the right, and just beyond that bend, a thin veil of smoke drifted downward from the lip of the cliffs above. Not enough to choke, but enough to confirm what Caleb had feared the moment they descended. They had taken the wrong path. The fire wasn't just behind them. It had looped them. Caleb stepped forward, squinting up at the narrow cut of sky. The walls climbed at least 40 feet on both sides, maybe more. Jagged, sheer. They weren't climbing out. Not here. Benny's voice dropped to a whisper. "We're funneled." Caleb nodded slowly. "And if it gets in, there's nowhere to run." They backed away from the curve, fast. "Map," Caleb said, already pulling his from the top pocket of his pack. They crouched beneath a slight overhang, drawing the paper flat on the rock. It was smudged, rain-streaked from the first night's deluge, but still readable. Caleb traced their path, estimating by terrain, the angle of descent, the twist of the canyon. "If we follow the gulch another half-mile, we hit a tributary," he muttered. "Cuts east. Is it a way out?" "Maybe. We don't have a choice." They moved again, faster now, urgent but not frantic. Caleb kept glancing skyward, gauging the smoke above them. The fire hadn't dropped into the gulch yet, but the color of the light was changing. It had been orange. Now it was gold. Gold meant the fire was close. The tributary came quickly, barely a dent in the wall at first, then widening into a passage they could slip through. It sloped upward, thank God. Not a climb, but a steady lift, gaining just enough elevation that Caleb's ears began to pop from the shift in air pressure. For a while, they said nothing. They climbed. They sweated. The stone was redder here, iron-rich, brittle. Small flakes came off under their boots. And still the smoke came. More now, in waves, thicker, a hint of ash curling on the edge of the wind. And then, sound, a low, rushing whisper. It wasn't fire, not the roar of a crown blaze. Not yet. It was wind, but coming with the smoke, not pushing it away, pulling it, a backdraft. Caleb spun. "It's drawing in." Benny's eyes went wide. "Then it's coming." They ran. The gulch behind them darkened. Fast. A black haze rolled in like fog, and the canyon lit with strange flickering light, reflections of something unseen above the rim. The fire wasn't in the slot yet, but it was overhead. And if it found a way, Caleb felt it first. Heat. A wave of it passed down the corridor, like a furnace door opening. The sandstone beside them pulsed with warmth. The wind turned savage, backward, chaotic, pushing instead of pulling. It had found an opening. "Go!" Caleb shouted. They scrambled faster, heartbeats climbing into the red. The slope steepened, walls shifting as the gulch forked. Left, right. No time to hesitate. Caleb grabbed Benny's arm and yanked him right. The stone curved and opened wider ahead. And then light. Not sky. Firelight. A sheet of flame roared down from above, cutting across the top of the slot. It hadn't dropped into the gulch yet, but it lit the sandstone in rippling orange. A crack of sound chased it, like a jet engine being torn in half, then another blast of heat. Caleb swore. "It's jumping the canyon. We have to get out. We have to—" "There." Caleb pointed. A split in the rock, a fracture that looked barely passable. It led upward, sharply, too narrow for packs. They dropped them. Benny went first, scrambling with knees and elbows. Caleb followed, lungs burning, one hand gripping Benny's boot to help shove him up the squeeze. The stone tore at their arms, scraped their ribs, but they moved, because behind them the gulch was no longer dark. It was glowing. Then, open air, a ledge, real sky, smoke-choked, but there. They tumbled out, scraped raw, panting, and turned just in time to see the canyon below erupt, a ribbon of flame corkscrewing through the gulch like a living thing, devouring the path they'd just escaped. Neither of them spoke. They couldn't. There was nothing left to say. They had made a wrong turn, and somehow they had survived it. Chapter 20. Still running, still alive. Now what? They didn't rest long. Not after what happened. Caleb collapsed onto the ledge, trembling, every joint flooded with adrenaline and exhaustion. Benny lay beside him, silent, staring at the hazed sky. Their lungs heaved. The air tasted scorched and dry. The weight of their escape pressed on both of them like a physical force. The fire had jumped the canyon. It wasn't behind them anymore. It had overtaken the path they'd been on. They couldn't go back. They wouldn't go forward that way again. Yet they were still here. On this ledge, two ragged men covered in dirt and blood, still breathing. Still alive. Caleb forced himself upright, hands braced on knees. His vision was blurry. Sweat and grime stung his eyes. He swallowed. "We need water." Benny nodded but didn't move. "Yeah." They looked around. This ledge was a narrow shelf carved into the canyon wall. Below, the fire roared. Above, the sky was bright with smoke. Around them, the stone rose in barren cliffs, fractured by heat and erosion. It felt eternal, cold, distant. Caleb reached into his pack, pulled out a nearly empty water bottle. He tilted it. Only a few milliliters sloshed out. Enough for a small swig. Benny took it, drank everything, his lips trembling with relief and despair. Caleb took the empty bottle, tucked it back. "We make camp here." His voice was hollow. Benny didn't argue. He sank to his feet, knees shaking, and pressed his back against the canyon wall. It gave him purchase. He closed his eyes. Anything deeper now would mean climbing. They had nothing left for that. They sank down, packs dropped, bodies slumped. Caleb leaned forward, hands on the rock, catching his breath. They said nothing. Didn't need to. The canyon spoke for them. Heat echoed off stone. Embers drifted in the current below. Every crackling branch was a reminder. Night would come soon. Caleb pulled his journal from his pack, a crumpled sheet of paper with map lines and notes. He stared at it, squinted. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a faded marking. "Northwest. There's a switchback ridge. It could lead us to that plateau." Maple and pine on the topo looked different. Thicker, higher elevation. Benny's head flicked toward it. Elevation means shade. Maybe water. His voice cracked. Caleb nodded. "If we can make it up before dark." Their eyes met. They shared the silent agreement. No other option. They moved again as the sun faded. Climbing was slow. Pain flared in muscles unaccustomed to upward strain. Their packs scraped rock. Sweat matted their clothes. Benny stumbled and Caleb caught him, both nearly falling. They righted themselves silently. No blame, only shared purpose. The smoke swirl made breathing unpredictable. They paused on narrow shelves, letting the wind clear. Each time they looked back, the gorge behind them burned yellow and white, flames leaping skyward. Above, the plateau walls glowed faintly in the setting sun. It was beautiful and terrible, like a promise and a threat. They reached the plateau's rim just as day died. They collapsed beside a cluster of scrub brush and a small overhang. The ground sloped gently away under their shoulders. Below, canyon depths glowed in ember light. Above, sky was stripped, copper and steel. Benny stared at the horizon. "We made it." Caleb didn't respond. He looked down at the ground, pressed his aching hand against cool stone. He tore a piece of his shirt and pressed it to Benny's knee, cleaning the scrapes. The heat finally left the air. That night they slept, or tried to. Neither moved much, but the small breeze and the cooler air meant a quiet that wasn't fraught. They woke to wind. A thin breeze from the northwest, blowing across the plateau. It brought distant birdsong, warbler trill, pale and uncertain. They both sat up, startled by sound. The canyon below still smoked but seemed calmer. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Maybe it's shifting." Benny frowned. "Shall we test it?" They stood, each feeling weakness in their legs, their faces drained, lips cracked, hair matted. But they stood. They moved north along the plateau's edge, slow and steady. Every few steps they paused, scanning the horizon. Above, the sky almost looked clear. Maybe the wind had pushed the smoke away. Maybe there was water beyond the next ledge. Maybe release. They moved on. Night fell for the second time. This time the sky bore a sliver of moon, pale but real. They found a depression between boulders, a small shelter from the wind. They lay side by side. Caleb reached for Benny's arm. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we're going to get out." Benny turned. "Yeah." They fell into fitful sleep, two survivors in a stone wilderness. They didn't know when it would come. Rescue. But hope lingered on the plateau, fragile but alive. Chapter 21. Somewhere above them, the world kept turning. They didn't speak at first. The dawn was strange, too quiet. No bird song, no insects, no wind. Just the stillness of scorched wilderness holding its breath. The plateau had offered a temporary reprieve, but it didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a waiting room. Benny stirred first. He sat up stiffly, legs sore from the climb, every movement cautious. He winced at the sight of his hands, scraped, swollen knuckles, fingers stained with soot. Caleb lay on his side, eyes open, unmoving. He blinked once, slowly. "How long you think we've got?" Benny asked quietly. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at the sky, smoke-stained but lighter than it had been in days. The smell was still there, baked into everything. But the fire's breath felt distant now. Not long, Caleb said eventually, but long enough. Benny stared out across the barren ridge. The land beyond looked cracked and colorless. Shale and scrub, no promise, no trail, just open exposure. But the wind had shifted. That had to mean something. They ate the last of the food ration, half a crushed granola bar Caleb had forgotten in a side pocket. They didn't chew so much as let it dissolve in their mouths, savoring each grain. Benny nearly cried, tasting it. Caleb stared at the horizon instead. Then they stood, shoulders stiff, knees shaky. And they moved. The plateau narrowed after a while, funneled into a descent between two jutting ridges. It felt like walking into the spine of the earth. The sandstone curled inward, forcing them single file. Every step down came with risk. Loose gravel, exposed rock, sudden shifts in footing. Caleb led. Benny followed, breathing through gritted teeth. They passed a charred animal carcass at the bottom of the chute, some small deer or mountain goat, unrecognizable in the ash. Benny looked away. Caleb didn't. They kept walking. Midday came and went in silence. The sun scorched overhead, unfiltered now that the smoke had thinned. Caleb had begun to feel it in his skull, sharp and humming, a low pressure that made the edges of his vision tremble. He didn't tell Benny. Benny didn't ask. They rationed the last mouthful of water, one swallow each. Benny poured a few drops on his cracked lips before tipping the rest into Caleb's palm. Caleb drank it dry. Then they walked again. They crested a shale saddle late that afternoon and found themselves staring out at a valley they didn't recognize. But it was green. Real green, like summer. Trees stood intact along the far slope. Pines, not a huge patch, but more than they'd seen in days. Between the canyon folds below, a ribbon of silver caught the light. Water. Benny laughed. A breathless, soundless thing that escaped like a sob. "Oh my God," he whispered. Caleb just kept looking. "We go." They scrambled down the saddle, boots sliding in fine grit. A small wash opened to their left, steep, narrow, but leading straight toward the green. They dropped into it. The descent shredded what was left of their strength. They had to slide in places, brace with elbows and forearms. Benny fell once and split open the skin above his eyebrow. Blood trickled down his cheek. He wiped it away and kept going. Caleb nearly passed out at one point. His knees buckled, his vision pulsed red, but Benny caught his pack strap, yanked him upright. "Hey, no dying now." Caleb coughed. "Wouldn't dream of it." They stumbled the final stretch on instinct alone. When they reached the floor of the canyon, the water was real. Not a river, more of a steady creek winding around polished stones, clear enough to see the bottom. Caleb dropped to his knees and plunged both hands in. It was cold. Sharp and glorious. Benny followed suit, scooping water into his mouth, shaking, eyes wide. They drank too fast and both gagged, but it didn't matter. It was water. Real water. They washed the soot from their faces, the blood, the exhaustion. Benny laughed again, louder this time, water dripping from his chin. Caleb didn't laugh. He just looked at Benny, then at the sky above them. Smoke still clouded the rim of the gorge, but the wind was holding, blowing it away. "We're close," Caleb said, voice low. "I don't know where exactly, but this isn't far from civilization." Benny nodded slowly. "You think we'll make it out tomorrow?" "I think we might make it out today." They followed the creek. It curved between rising walls, then flattened out again. Just when they were about to stop, when their legs felt like gelatin, Benny froze. He pointed. Up ahead, across the gully, a flicker of white. Not smoke, not ash. Canvas. Something flapping on a stick. No, not a stick, a pole, a tent. They ran. It wasn't a rescue team. It was a remote wildlife observation station, tiny, temporary, half-collapsed, probably unmanned. But it had a radio, a real one, solar-powered, antennae intact. Caleb practically fell through the tent flap. He dropped to his knees beside the transceiver, flipped the power. Nothing. Tried again. It lit up. Benny's breath caught. Holy. Caleb didn't wait. He turned the dial and spoke, his voice shaking with every word. This is an emergency call. Repeat, emergency. 2 survivors, west side of the Laramie Gorge system, elevation approx. 7,200 feet, wildfire conditions, immediate extraction needed. He let go of the button. Static. Then, crackling. A voice. Copy that. Repeat, we have your location. Sit tight. Air unit inbound. Benny sat down hard, face buried in his hands. Caleb just stared at the radio. Neither of them moved. The gorge still burned. The air still trembled with heat, but for the first time in 3 days, they weren't running anymore. They were found. Chapter 24. Nothing burned forever. It's strange how the body remembers things the mind tries to forget. Sometimes I'll be walking through the woods. Just a regular hike, marked trail, sunlight dripping through the trees, and out of nowhere, my chest tightens. I'll smell dry pine needles or hear the crack of a twig, and suddenly I'm there again, smoke crawling up the ridgelines, heat pressing in from every direction. Benny beside me, staggering through ash with bleeding hands and cracked lips, not saying a word because we didn't need to. We already knew. It's not every day, not even most days. But it's still in me, somewhere, like an ember that never went out. Like a lesson you carry so deep in your bones you stop realizing it's a lesson. But life did go on. We made it out. They flew us out in a chopper that same evening right before sunset. I don't remember most of that ride. Just the cold air on my face, the burn of clean water in my throat. Benny's hand gripping mine tighter than it ever had. We were changed after that, of course. You don't walk out of something like that untouched, but not in the way people expect. We didn't become monks or adrenaline junkies or wilderness preachers. We didn't swear off hiking forever, and we didn't pretend like it never happened either. We just lived. Benny went back to school first, took a few classes in forestry of all things. Said he wanted to understand what made the landscape turn like that, how a place could go from paradise to hell in less than a day. He works with fire prevention now, consulting on land management, still hikes the occasional backcountry trail, but only with GPS and satellite comms. He's quieter now, steadier. But there's still that fire in him too. The good kind, the kind that keeps you moving when your legs don't want to. He got married last spring, small wedding, mountain view in the background. I was his best man, which made sense, since we've already been through worse than any wedding speech could top. As for me, I stayed close to the land, too. I didn't think I would. I thought I'd run back to concrete and glass and swear off trees for good. But somehow, the wilderness still pulls at me. Maybe it's because I feel safer knowing what it can take. I lead group treks now, mostly teens and college kids. We stick to marked trails, but I teach them how to read terrain, how to listen to wind, how to respect the silence between trees. I don't tell them everything I've been through. Just enough. Just the parts they need to hear. Some nights I wake up and I think I smell the smoke again, or hear it, the hiss of it, the whisper of fire eating through brush like paper. I sit up fast, heart pounding, muscles tensed like I've forgotten I'm safe. But I am safe. We both are. And maybe that's the only thing I really want to say now after all these years. We walked through something that should have broken us. We didn't. It came close. Closer than I'll ever let myself admit out loud. But we made it. Not because we were stronger than the fire. We weren't. But because we refused to let go of each other. There's not a single day that goes by where I don't feel lucky for that. And not a single step I take now that I don't remember what it cost.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay safe.